Thank you. Whoa, okay. I'm delighted to be here today to try to answer the wonderful challenge that Sarah and Allison have given me to talk about my experiences in collaboration and share some thoughts and advice. Thank you so much to the Fox Center and the Center for Faculty Development and Excellence for having me. Although I don't usually do this, I usually show like tons of pictures and just let them remind me what to say. I'm actually going to read today, so my apologies, because this is my first talk specifically about collaboration, and I don't want to forget anything. So here's a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about today. Basically, a little bit about why collaborate in the humanities, some general principles that I've drawn from thinking a lot about the collaborations I've been involved in for many years, different kinds. And then I'm going to outline just some particular kinds of models or structures of collaboration that I have some experience with, might be interesting, and end with a little further introduction to Publishing Makerspace. So, right. So I'm going to try to focus on the positive while I'm talking today, what works, which implies what doesn't work so well without my having to tell a lot of awful stories, such as the one in which two supposedly collaborating project teams on two different campuses had programmers breaking each other's code while they were trying to competitively work on a website. That sort of thing. Well, I could tell those stories all day, but this is a wonderful opportunity to step back and reflect on what does work and why it works. So why collaboration? Yes, if you're here today, you're interested in collaboration or thinking about it, or at least curious about it, great. Here are some brief thoughts about why one might want to collaborate. Well, first of all, we already collaborate. So it's important to recognize it and appreciate it, make it more transparent, and in so doing, get more out of it. A second point, you don't have to do everything yourself, unless you really want to. You can collaborate with a software developer, a mapping specialist, and others who already have expertise and skills you wish you had time to learn. A third point, collaboration enriches a project. More minds make the project better. I don't just mean more skills, but more minds that have ideas. Because sometimes those people, that programmer or the mapping specialist, really have ideas that can make a project more exciting, more effective, more beautiful or elegant, more meaningful, really. Finally, I wanted to mention also that students' future workplaces will demand collaborative work. So it's time for us to learn to do it so that we can teach them how to collaborate and we can collaborate with them. So the ideal is stone soup. I don't know if you all know this folk tale, but basically these strangers arrive in a town with they say, this is a magical stone we're going to make soup out of, and it turns out everyone brings one carrot or one onion, the whole town comes together and adds to their pot with the stone in it, and it turns into a delicious community soup and community dinner. So everyone puts in what they have, and the result is more than the sum of its parts, and that's kind of an important point. So I'll return to the idea of the community dinner later. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about some kind of generally applicable advice and reflections I've been thinking about in thinking back over these decades, but who's counting, of collaboration. Okay, so the first point I wanted to make is what I call the importance of the third thing. So what is the collaboration about? Sometimes we get together to explore ideas, but pretty soon there needs to be a project to focus on or the talks will fall apart. For example, we were just talking about this, librarians and publishers, who would all seem to have the public good in mind, in my view, sometimes don't get along very well. Librarians think publishers are lording it over them and charging unfair prices and restricting access to scholarship with their draconian control over copyrights, While publishers think librarians willfully refuse to understand business or appreciate editorial work and are going to throw the baby out with the bathwater with their impractical open access movement. We could go on about this all day. And I don't mean to digress and get myself in hot water with librarians whom I greatly love and appreciate, except to note how unfortunate it is to see publishers and librarians disagree. But what's fascinating is that when there's a project to work on together, a third thing in the room, all this is forgotten in the excitement of sharing expertise and devising solutions, resulting in renewed appreciation of different kinds of expertise. I credit Courtney Berger at Duke University Press, a member of our original Publishing Makerspace team, for this insightful observation. So, the efficacy of a meeting just for general discussion or rapprochement is going to be limited, even among parties that start out with goodwill or at least neutrality. Try to have a third thing in mind and invite people to advise you on it. People are usually fairly flattered by the implicit admiration and respect in that type of invitation. Another way to put this is that a great project has a mission to accomplish. That is, besides the goal of having some people work together well. That mission can be articulated by the person who spearheads it and honed and given concrete expression by collaborators. For example, Mary Kate and Lingold, now at Virginia Commonwealth University, started the Sonic Dictionary, DH project at the Franklin Humanities Institute at Duke because she wanted sound and sound studies to be recognized as a rich way of looking at the world and human society. She puts it much better than that. As she collaborated, she found that that mission enhanced and transformed by others who brought pedagogical techniques and online exhibit capabilities to the project. Okay, number 2, principle of reciprocity. It can sound unrealistic to expect people to share their ideas and expertise freely and appreciate each other in new ways just like that. We all know human nature and how it expresses itself in academia, corporate world too. It's important to remember that people want what they want, and they want to enhance their own stature. Now it sounds as if I just went from idealism to complete cynicism in one wild but inevitable 180-degree swoop. But actually, I'm looking for the balance, which I believe is to be found in reciprocity. Here's my advice. Make sure that every participant in a collaboration is getting something concrete for themselves out of it. There's nothing wrong with that. They contribute ideas and expertise and get credit on the website or a place to publish their opinion. They spend time and work hard and get paid money. Students, they co-sponsor a high-profile talk and their class gets a private conversation with the speaker, etc., etc. You get the idea. Okay, principle of transparency, hierarchy and credit, and the Collaborators' Bill of Rights. So Tom Scheinfeld, who now leads the Greenhouse Studios at the University of Connecticut, he first pointed this Collaborators' Bill of Rights out to me. It comes from 2011, but I like it a lot and recommend it. So you can look for it online. Of course, the ideal of co-authorship, partnership, and crediting everyone is lovely in the ideal, and we see it in the sciences more, tons and tons of co-authors on articles, right? The nitty-gritty of crediting and thanking people and thanking entities can be complicated. As always, the devil is in the details. Look at movie credits, for an example. Or take the staff pages we used to publish in our encyclopedias at Scribner's. People can get really bent out of shape because you listed them as an assistant editor instead of an associate editor or whatever. Recently, I saw that a group of researchers had decided to co-author an article as a collective anonymous so that they would not have to fuss about all of this. But I don't think most people would agree to that or that it's a useful solution. One thing I found useful is to focus on each person's role in the project. The person might be officially, according to corporate HR, an administrative assistant or editorial assistant, but on the project, she might be the permissions editor. People like that, and everyone recognizes that it's fair. It's good to circulate a draft of the credits and let everyone comment on it. Why not err on the side of generosity? Maybe I was too modest on some of those staff pages. Now I look back in these encyclopedias and you'd never know I was in charge of the whole thing, as if I put my name on the bottom. But I'm still looking for the right balance myself. So treat yourself right too. But I promise it will not take anything away from you to acknowledge others. On the contrary, your generosity will make you look powerful, well-connected, and confident. Plus, people will want to work with you again in the future. Essentially, collaboration in the open and transparent ideal is about mutual respect. People bring different kinds of expertise into the room. Some of it comes from formal education and training. Some of it comes from apprenticeships and learning on the job, and some of it that is also very valuable comes from people's different life stories. People talk about safe spaces, and the makerspace or collaborative table should be one of those. An important practice in such a room is listening, creating a meeting structure in which we hear from everyone, whether or not they have an outgoing personality. As an aside, this is one of the things that concerns me about experiments and open or voluntary online peer review, the new default we might be creating in which some of the most thoughtful and valuable voices might be missing. We just had a talk by Donna Haraway at Duke, and people were moved by how she talked about acknowledging ideas from her students in her notes. And she found it humbling when she realized how many of her ideas didn't come from her. But all the ideas don't come from the top. So that's where I come into the principle of equity, and I had interesting conversations with the Duke Human Rights Center at FHI people about this. So this is the point at which to mention ingrained power structures and issues of race and gender. The older I get, the more I have to learn about this. Racism is real, and so is the glass ceiling, which is installed lower than I thought it was when I first started out. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but a while ago, I won't even say what university this was because it's not the point anyway, I heard about a graduate student group in which it turned out that the male graduate students were planning the events and the women graduate students were handling the logistics and the catering. How do these things happen? We even do it to ourselves. Look around the room and think actively about who is there and what their roles are. Is everyone in the room white? Who do I expect the creative ideas to come from? Who made the coffee? The phrase affirmative action was wise because of the word affirmative. It's so easy for my actions to mechanically suit the default power structure, I have to be actively awake. I am still a work in progress, but I know enough to say that the default power structure, unfortunately, is still the default, and generalized good intentions are not sufficient to the situation. I learned to use the first person singular in that way, as opposed to the presumptive second person, you do this, you do that, you think this, at a workshop on racism at FHI. I would highly recommend the type of workshop that the Duke Human Rights Center, DHRC, at FHI has run to help participants become more aware of their own ingrained prejudices and work more effectively to combat them in daily life. The nonprofit that ran the workshops for us has unfortunately gone out of business, but there are others. I took a very similar one some 20 years ago in New York. Emily Stewart of the DHRC at FHI has been working with Duke's Office of Civic Engagement to put together a Racial Equity Institute training for staff and faculty as one of their priorities in a Duke project called the Civic Action Plan. I highly recommend this training because it delves into the history of racism in our country and builds on what we learned from DR Works, this nonprofit that had helped us. My DHRC colleagues recommend co-facilitation of meetings. Have a man and a woman facilitate together, for example. It's also important to keep in mind the variety of personalities around the table. Some people are more outgoing than others. Some people love to hold the floor or interrupt with sudden flashes of inspiration. That's me. While other people are shy. Whoever is leading or moderating the meeting should be sure to ask everyone what he or she thinks and then wait for the answer. Sometimes the shy person takes a long, silent moment to formulate the answer. but it could be the smartest answer in the room, or it could represent an otherwise missing perspective in an important way. I think this is one reason that the design charrette exercise that the Publishing Makerspace Working Group has adopted from architecture and urban planning contexts is effective, because everyone is writing ideas on Post-its. Post-its are appealingly unintimidating. Some people might write fewer Post-its, but their contributions are given equal voice that way. Remember also that some people need more quiet time. If you're having a workshop that goes from working lunch to afternoon sessions to drinks and dinner, talking shop with no break, that might be intensely exciting for some people, while others just have to bow out to go recharge their batteries by themselves. Also, some people have kids they have to go home to, etc. So try to set a pace that works for everyone and to bring out their best work and sustain their enthusiasm. So I'm almost done with all of my many sort of general points, and I'm going to get into some specific collaborations in a minute. Appreciation and building trust is something else I wanted to mention. It's not just the published credits at the end of the project that make people feel appreciated. It's important to give people a pat on the back early and often, not only individually but as a group. There's a wonderful positive behavior management program that my daughter's school used called Nurtured Heart. And there are lots of things like that, but this one spoke to me. And it encourages what's called a snapshot, a recognition of something great that people did right at the moment that they did it. Aren't we an amazing group? We devised a plan for this website in one afternoon, or whatever. It's easy and surprisingly effective at keeping people feeling positive about their involvement in a group. My colleagues at the DHRC say trust can only be built up over time. That includes learning where people are coming from and learning how they communicate. Cultural differences come in a lot of different forms. It's important to build in time to listen. Barbara Lau, who founded the Polly Murray Project, says that launching right in can reinforce existing patterns. She says dating metaphors work really well. The cliche is that if you let your partner pay on the first date, it's hard to change that later. She says it's especially important for meeting facilitators to be very attentive to spoken, written, and body language. Remember, she works with community groups outside of the academy, but these things are important in any setting. So timing. I've seen many versions of schedules for collaborations, from publishing projects that took 5 years or more to produce, to a short intervention like a summer institute of a few days. It's hard to sustain a project of over more than a couple of years. Roles, interests, priorities, locations of people change. On the other hand, it's hard to produce anything with a collaboration that's too short, because it takes that time to establish trust and working relationships. Getting grant funding can be very clarifying because it forces a schedule on a project. There's nothing like a deadline to focus minds and spark teamwork. It's good for a project to have a trajectory. Perhaps there's a startup phase, a working phase for producing outcomes, and a follow-up or assessment phase. If it's working wonderfully and no one wants to stop, then you can have a renewal phase. At that point, you might expand the collaboration or change out some members of the group, but it helps for potential collaborators to see a beginning, middle, and end to the story in which they are about to take a role. Okay, so I think there must be as many ways to collaborate as there are stars in the sky or people in the world. To generalize about it, as a human phenomenon, I'd have to be a scholar like a sociologist or a psychologist or a philosopher of mind, and I'm none of those things. But I do have these decades, but who's counting, of experience with various kinds of collaboration. So I thought I would share some models and structures with you that I happen to have directed or coordinated or observed closely. They might give you some ideas. I'm going to skip for now my encyclopedia publishing experience. So if any of you has a burning desire to find out how you create a multi-volume and online interdisciplinary encyclopedia with an editorial board and hundreds or thousands of contributors, just see me later. Okay. Moving on to collaborations that happen on campuses. So the Publishing the Long Civil Rights Movement project that I directed at UNC Chapel Hill for 5 years was a collaboration of the University Press, the Southern Oral History Program at the Center for the Study of the American South, the Special Collections Library, and the Center for Civil Rights. So 4 entities on campus. That was almost too many for an efficient collaboration, though an important and meaningful theme of the long civil rights movement drew us together. And we did find a way for everyone to contribute and for everyone to benefit. 2 or 3 partners might be better. The project was unusually experimental in that the partners had not yet decided specifically what to do together when I was hired as director to run this big Mellon grant. We only knew that we were going to publish together on the long civil rights movement in innovative ways. As it turned out, we did so many things and produced so many outcomes, both behind the scenes and infrastructure, such as new production processes and metadata types at the press and new ways for oral history interviews to become immediately available in digital library collections, and publicly, such as an active multi-authored blog, an online collection with commenting functionality, new editions of archival slave narratives. I'll stop. And then there was the digitization of the entire SHOHP collection of 4,000 interviews, which might be one of the best, if most straightforward things I've ever done. As I say, we did so many things that in the end the project was maybe a victim of its own richness and variety, because I think it's hard now for people to remember exactly what we did. A lesson learned might be that in order to effectively communicate and share the outcome of a project, perhaps there should not be a dozen outcomes. 1 or 2 might actually be better. Working within and across the various campus entities was interesting. They were not physically located next to each other, and I did a lot of walking in those years. I thought it was important to show up at each location regularly and also to locate group meetings in the different spaces, particularly spaces that were attractive and interesting for the partners to visit where they would not normally come. But then I didn't want to make everyone go a long distance each time, so we took turns hosting. I also had coffee and lunch one-on-one with key participants regularly. Overall, working relationships were cordial and consistent. It was definitely important that the Mellon grant included a project director, which was lucky for me, but Mellon and other funding sources will pay for staff to make a project run. And that's important to keep in mind. I think if we think it's going to happen with 2% of this person's time and 10% of that person's time, that might not work so well. A project needs a central coordinator, whether a graduate student or staff person who can devote stretches of time to it consistently, not in fits and starts. Project management is a good skill for that person to have. All that said, the infrastructure wasn't so good. Honestly, budget tracking and fixing errors in the budget tracking drove me bananas. I don't want to go on and on about it, but there needed to be someone besides me to track what funds that they were being spent properly and gather all the numbers for Mellon reports. Also, there probably should have been some kind of contracting structure among the parties. I'm going to come back to that point. All universities have a grant management infrastructure, but I found actually working on that project and later on the CHCI projects that humanities-related entities on campus don't always know how to tap into that structure and make use of it. The sciences know, they know how. I'll say more about this when I get to the international, interinstitutional collaborations in a minute. So how am I doing time-wise? Okay, good, because I'm about halfway. Okay, so, right, collaborative models and structures continued. I'm sure since I come from the Franklin Humanities Institute, some people want to hear about humanities labs, so let me tell you what I can about those. You've probably heard about them. I believe that the Franklin Humanities Institute at Duke was the first humanities institute to run 3 humanities labs simultaneously. Now there are more, actually. There are 5. The interior architecture of our warehouse space in downtown Durham was designed especially for labs. So there's an expectation that the physical space will encourage collaboration. Each lab has a main room with a whiteboard and projection screen and movable tables with sliding doors on one side, where there are workspaces for the students, and offices on the other side for the lab directors, co-directors. The idea is that people have this physical connection and new ideas are sparked in this hub. There's a confidence in the power of serendipity and an expectation of unexpected outcomes, if that makes sense. Interestingly, we now have a lab that did not require the spatial model of collaboration, the Social Practice Lab, led by Pedro Lash, who takes his work out to public spaces, museums, and other countries, and said he did not need a space. That's an exception, though. The labs are intended to be experimental and last only 2 or 3 years. I think they start out with 2 years and then they can be renewed. Some seem to have been more successful than others. Some changed and morphed over time. In the end, the lab model not only continues, but has been picked up by the humanities departments and has influenced new programs such as Story Plus, which I'll describe in a minute. I'll describe the components of a lab and share a couple of examples of lab collaborations that have been successful. Here's a description of kind of what's expected from the last, I'm quoting now from the last CFP, which actually isn't available online at the moment because we have a new website. In 2010, Duke University's Franklin Humanities Institute became a pioneer in rolling out a new architecture of multiple humanities laboratories. Nice metaphor there of architecture. The shared community design of the labs brings faculty, graduate students, undergraduates, and other stakeholders together in a vertically integrated research, pedagogy, and practice. Lab co-directors are empowered to align their teaching to their research in a variety of structures involving apprentice-style learning, collaborative decision-making, and diverse forms of deliverables. FHI labs since 2010 have included the Haiti Lab, Greater Than Games, BorderWorks, Audiovisualities, the PhD Lab, the Global Brazil Lab, and the Story Lab. The Mellon now we have actually a social movements lab also. The FHI begins a second wave of humanities lab development at a time when outside of Duke University, as Inside Higher Ed noted, humanities labs primarily exist in earlier experimental stages on a handful of campuses. Furthermore, FHI humanities labs are now part of a burgeoning culture of collaboratories at Duke. From the arts and technology labs in the Department of Art, Art History, and Visual Studies, to the Innovation Co-Lab to Bass Connections teams, beginning in the fall of 2016, new FHI humanities labs are coalescing in diverse post-humanities writ large frameworks, meaning post-Mellon funding that started the labs. Notably, the Mobile and Multiply Affiliated Social Practice Lab and the FHI Health Humanities Lab, co-funded by the Provost and the Chancellor of Duke Health, operating within a sister institute, the Duke Global Health Institute. Each lab has faculty co-directors, a minimum of 2. To avoid overcommitment of junior faculty time and effort, no more than 1 lab co-director is an assistant professor. It also has additional faculty participants or affiliates and student helpers. Lab funding contributes course releases for the directors, student staff assistant, and event programming. A lab has both research and teaching objectives, and the lab space is intended to be used as a home base for these activities. Note that all the topics have been inherently multidisciplinary. The FHI hopes that labs will enable faculty to experiment and try new things. Some faculty are so entrepreneurial that they're spread too thin, and the lab's not supposed to be just one of those many, many, many things that that person's doing. Ideally, the lab structure enables them to interface with new interlocutors. Chris Chia, the FHI's associate director, remarked that some of our best, most enthusiastic participants are not humanists, but rather are from the sciences or social sciences, where they're not getting the community of interlocutors they wanted. Lab faculty have to want to interface with new people. An example of a lab's kind of open innovation is a favorite thing of mine. The Story Lab has a co-writing session every Friday afternoon where you just go and sit in there for a couple of hours, and people come from anthropology or the sciences or wherever. Someone's writing a novel, and we all just sit there and write, and I wrote some of this today, this paper there. So there is an emphasis on what is called vertical integration. That is, undergraduates to senior faculty and everyone in between is intended to be included and involved. This is a challenge because sometimes undergraduates are not prepared to be of real assistance to a scholarly research project. Suddenly immersed in an archive, for example, they did not know what to take notes on, what not to take notes on. Some students have ended up doing independent study projects together, sort of an oxymoron, and those turn into honors theses, while some faculty have had to change their idea about what their lab is going to do. Faculty find that it takes work to devise interactive, collaborative assignments for students, and some students find that up till now, there was a gap in their education, which was working collaboratively, and they do appreciate the opportunity. I also wanted to remark that our director, Deborah Jensen, has pointed out that faculty who direct labs are entrepreneurial, and they often take that managerial experience from running the lab to higher administrative positions. It was an interesting step that helped to develop their career. There are so many ways to collaborate, and the labs are very flexible. It's hard to say what is more or less successful, but I'll point out a few examples of projects that were especially collaborative. One happened in the Border Works lab, where Phil Stern, a history professor, having realized that students were unprepared to help him with a mapping project, turned to a museum exhibit project for which the students wrote the texts. They contributed meaningfully to the exhibit and learned a lot in the process. Two of my favorite examples happened in the Haiti lab, co-directed by Laurent Dubois and Deborah Jensen. One was sparked by the earthquake disaster. The lab participants started researching the history of cholera in Haiti and found that there had never been any cholera in Haiti in the past. This led to the conclusion that foreign aid workers had carried it into the country, leading to a high-profile journal publication that was picked up by the New York Times. You probably heard about it, and other news outlets around the world. The other was an art project that has become an icon of the FHI, Haiti in Amber. It's a mosaic in which each backlit resin tile represents a theme or event in the history of Haiti that was researched by lab participants, students on up. An artist helped them turn their collages into amber-colored baked tiles, which were then assembled on the wall of our lecture hall. I think it's especially significant that in both cases, the journal article and the mosaic, something was produced that would not have existed without the lab. That's the ideal. Not that faculty got funding to do something they were going to do anyway, but that something new is created collectively. The collaboration is more than the sum of its parts, and like the soup, the mosaic is the perfect metaphor for that. So I mentioned a sort of burgeoning culture of collaboration at Duke, and this is one of the projects that has been inspired by labs. It's called Story Plus. It's a new program at Duke. In a 3-week pressure cooker during the summer, a group of undergraduates help a professor with a research project. The first set of Story Plus projects were accomplished last summer, with the FHI as their home base. Some projects were well defined at the start, like a website that a professor wanted to have as a supplement to his book, while others were doing archival research or working with a local nonprofit in ways that were less predefined. In evaluations, students talked a lot about feeling that their majors trained them to be solitary researchers, and it was helpful to get and learn to take feedback from others. They also had to use the short time strategically. For example, a couple of groups found it useful to split up during a given week so that some students would focus on writing, while another group learned about data visualization. They were trying to find for themselves that sweet spot between having some kind of structure so that people would not be just floating off into outer space, but being flexible in order to focus on needs as they come up. The FHI staff felt they wanted to do more community building activities. Other than those, there were midterm presentations. You see a picture of one there. Do more to connect the groups. I wasn't directly involved in Story Plus, so I'm indebted to Chris Chia, Associate Director of FHI, for these comments. It's interesting to see how the lab model is proliferating at Duke. It's also entering the humanities departments, which challenges the FHI to continue to define and refine our interdisciplinary, spatially oriented lab model. When the Consortium of Humanities Centers and Institutes, otherwise known as CHCI, hosted at that time by the FHI, first hired me in early 2013. It was basically because I had experience running multi-partner Mellon-funded projects. It wasn't really because of my publishing experience. All the projects involved various types of publishing, which was always my favorite part. But this was actually my first time not working in a publishing company, because even at UNC, my office was at the press. CHCI eventually received a total of $2.5 million from Mellon to run international interinstitutional experiments in collaboration, each focused on a theme and each with a slightly different collaborative structure. The themes were humanities for the environment, religion, secularism, and political belonging, medical humanities, and indigeneity. I want to note that I don't work for CHCI anymore. Its home base is now the University of Wisconsin-Madison, while I have a new role at FHI. So my remarks on these collaborations are just mine. I think experimental can be a useful word, because even if the collaboration isn't entirely successful, there were still lessons learned from the experiment, making it inherently successful as an experiment. All of the project partners were brilliant, creative, and hardworking in each of the 19 humanities centers and institutes around the world who were involved, produced meaningful and worthwhile research, events, and publications. Stepping back and looking at them overall, I would say that there was a lot of working in parallel, with meetings and workshops to share work and inspire or surprise each other, but not as much actual collaboration until people started assembling papers into edited collections toward the end. The topics were all quite cutting edge, but in retrospect, I would say that if the topic is not well established on campus, it might be too ambitious to expect to establish it and collaborate across the globe with other universities at the same time. This was a challenge for the medical humanities group, though they ended up creating an international network for mutual support that is still growing and having wonderful conferences. Some interesting ways to work across national and cultural divides were to create a unified website to feature the work from the various sites, discuss shared readings chosen in turn by each partner, devise a set of keyword essays defining terms from different cultural perspectives and disciplinary perspectives, and, this seemed especially collaborative and effective, advise each other's PhD students. This last thing happened in the project on indigeneity that might be said to have been the most effective as a collaboration, because the structure had the potential to apply to other themes in the future. Its official name was IGERT, Integrated Graduate Humanities Education and Training. Did I get that right? Yeah, IGHE, and research training. I left out a word. Well, it was complicated. Okay. It was a partnership of 4 humanities centers, UC Santa Cruz, Eustace Liebig University in Gießen, Germany, Australian National University, that's the one in Canberra, and the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. It helped to have one of the 4 as an agreed hub. That was Santa Cruz. The 2.5-year collaboration was punctuated by 4 workshops, hosted in turn by each of the 4 humanities centers. Each workshop included the following elements, expressed differently as appropriate to the location. 1, shared readings provided by the host center. 2, panels in which the graduate students had the opportunity to present their work. 3, related conferences, talks, and exhibits showcasing locally embedded indigeneities. For example, Ojibwe poetry and native subjects in Milwaukee, Aboriginal art and its relationship to museums in Australia, etc. 4, writing workshops in which the graduate students worked on particular problems in their dissertations with advisors from outside their discipline and or location. And finally, 5, a training exercise in which the graduate students were filmed, giving a pithy elevator speech on their scholarship, potentially for a public audience. In Milwaukee, they did it in an actual campus TV studio. They did really well. They had practice already. The collaboration created a safe, open space in which to raise critical questions and attack hard problems in a constructive spirit. The participants spoke of the group dynamic that had developed that made the collaboration more than the sum of its parts. A guest at the final workshop in Gießen, Stephen Sleeman from the University of Alberta, described the meeting as intellectually exhilarating, going on to say, I quote from his email, "By the time you get to my age in the profession, you've been through a lot of academic gigs. I'm writing now to say that my experience at the IGRT meeting this past week will absolutely prove itself to be one of the most long-lasting for me. What I heard and saw as the event proceeded may be as close as we can ever come to the academic ideal. People sharing their work, and not just doing that, but also going to the difficulty. No defensiveness, no hiding, colleagues responding in a spirit of enormous support, and yet also getting to the particulars. Nobody pulling rank or talking down, no condescension, no sucking up. There was real methodological disagreement in the room. Critical thought needs that. But at the same time, I felt always a genuine sense of common purpose and common commitment." Unquote. One thing that made this collaboration work well was the third thing that I mentioned earlier. In this case, the third thing was the PhD students. Teaching and training them brought out the best in the collaborators. Another thing that worked well about this collaboration was the tightly integrated structure that was planned from the beginning. The project partners did not have to work out how they would collaborate over time. They'd already decided and committed. It's an interesting model. So, since I mentioned the word structure, that's kind of like a transition now to my last little bit about infrastructure. I promise this isn't long. One could go on and on about this, but coming out of publishing, I found a publishing contract is very clarifying and useful. A written plan, a memorandum of understanding, or a contract can be helpful. A contract is about setting expectations. If there's no relationship of trust to begin with, a contract won't fix it. But a written agreement can concretize the plan, define roles, and make people feel more secure. I've actually just been corresponding with Carrie Johnston at Wake Forest, who is a digital scholarship librarian there, and she uses a project charter process, which defines roles, and she's continuing to develop that for DH projects. To share a grant across institutions, subcontracts are used. This is part of that support infrastructure for grants that the sciences know how to tap into that I found many humanities centers really had no idea about. So these subcontracts are very normal between universities, but some participants who haven't heard about them before find the idea of a subcontract sort of insulting. The word itself bothers them, which is a diplomatic issue to get over. Many humanists are surprised to learn that their own university already has many such subcontracts, and there's probably well-established infrastructure, Office of Research Support, Office of Grant Management, or something like that. All right, so it was a learning experience for them, and I spent an inordinate amount of time when I was working with these. There were 19 humanities centers collaborating on the 4 projects, and actually 20 subcontracts because one of them was involved in 2. So I spent an inordinate amount of time on contractual invoices and reimbursements. Hated them, but someone has to do it, which is good to know. A collaboration needs an acknowledged leader or 2, but not too many. It's a good idea to write a coordinator, a manager into the plan. I mentioned that earlier already. This person has to be good at managing people who do not report directly to him or her. That is part of collaboration, right? Getting people to do things who don't actually report directly to you. With a grant, don't ask for more money than you really need to accomplish the project. Sometimes it seems prestigious to get a big award. But FHI's Director of Administration, Pamela Montgomery, who's managed grant financials for some 20 years and not all at FHI, other parts of Duke also, says humanists are the only ones who don't spend their money. I guess we're not used to having any. But she has never seen anything like it, she says. Remember, you're going to have to spend down. You don't want the funder to think you don't really need all that money that they generously agreed to give you. Finally, a collaboration does not have to be huge and ambitious to work. Starting small could be a good idea. So finally, my last little section, I'm going to talk a little bit about my favorite thing, of course, publishing. My specialty, my career, vocation, and favorite thing in all its forms. Publishing has always been collaborative. Think about it. The person who copy edited your book is not the same as the editor who offered you a contract and solicited peer reviews and assessed them to help you respond to them. The person who designed the interior of your book is not the same person who designed the cover of the book. The person who helped with the picture permissions is not the same as the person who sized the pictures for the compositor. The person who typeset the book is not the same as the person who proofread it. A committee probably decided on the price and possibly the perfect title for the book as well, and so on. On the title page is one name, so all of this is behind the scenes. Publishers are used to that, and no one minds, at least until librarians and the public forget that they did anything at all, and that this hard work and coordination takes expertise and judgment and time. Publishers are not very good at, or usually very interested in, explaining what they do. And meanwhile, I worry that publishing is so transparent that it's too easy to discount and devalue. A truism among publishers is that the really nice, appreciative authors who are a pleasure to work with are the ones who thank you in the preface. The difficult authors who take umbrage at every suggestion and seem to expect the worst at every step are the ones who forget to thank anyone. So in traditional publishing, just thank some people in the acknowledgments. Now I'm going to finish with a few remarks about Publishing Makerspace, as we're going to be doing Publishing Makerspace Perfect tomorrow. In 2014, I founded a working group called Publishing Makerspace. The idea was to bring together researchers and authors, university press editors and marketers, technology and DH experts, librarians and archivists to collaborate on publishing multimodal projects in a more interconnected and holistic way, potentially making the projects more meaningful and exciting, and ultimately redefining publishing to include all the forms of work that scholars are creating today. Just to be ambitious. The original working group from Wake Forest, UNC Chapel Hill, Duke's FHI, Duke University Press, and UNC Press invented a kind of workshop in which all these people would begin to collaborate because they were focused on a third thing, an incipient project. We use a design charrette visioning exercise that was brought to us by David Phillips at Wake Forest, who studies architecture and urban design. I look forward to sharing this approach here tomorrow and maybe to sparking some new collaborations before I go back to North Carolina. So I like to call Publishing Makerspace a movable feast because the space, unlike at FHI, right, is wherever we assemble to cook something up together. I'll end with an example of a collaboration that takes us full circle, back to the soup. One of CHCI's Humanities for the Environment, one of CHCI's collaborations, the leader of that collaboration, Sally Kitch at Arizona State, invited a group to envision a dinner 2040. That was the first time I saw the design charrette technique of short time spurts of brainstorming used. Scholars from various disciplines, an artist, an environmentalist who lived on an Indian reservation, a chef, a diverse group, invented a community dinner that would be about resilience in the desert landscape. I'll end there with that nice image, which we hope will come true metaphorically and concretely. Thank you.